work nicely. I can tell you when I switched you.
It doesn't matter. Madelyne fights with me today.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy. So after watching X-Men 97, there's a few lingering questions that the show didn't bother answering. And I think the main one is, who the heck is the real Jean Grey? But that's a question we should all be asking because really there is a good chance that the Jean Grey that we knew and loved for years has actually been dead this entire time. Now this actually opens up a whole philosophical can of worms about identity, the nature of self, and we're going to get into some really heavy philosophical questions. So a little later, I'm going to talk with an actual professional philosopher about what we might have missed and how X-Men 97 killed Jean and did brilliant philosophy at the same time. Now, comic book characters have a long history of exploring the most difficult questions that human beings can ask. The Joker argues that art can be homicide.
I am the world's first fully functioning homicidal artist.
Loki struggles with time.
We die with the dying. We're born with the dead.
The Watchmen makes us think about morality.
Killing millions.
To save billions. A necessary crime.
But X-Men 97 uses Jean Grey's journey to ask the philosophical question, who is Jean Grey? And by extension, what is the definition of our own personal identity?
Well, wait, what do you mean by that?
Well, in the show, we learn that Jean has been cloned, but the clone also has her memories. So, which one is the real Jean Grey?
Jean Doe is older. The proper age, yours while identical, is not. Ergo,
Our Jean is a clone.
Well, I mean, it would be the first one, right? The one who's not the clone?
You'd think that, but it's really not that cut and dry. This is actually a philosophical question called the problem of identity, and comic books have actually been tackling this problem for like decades. Essentially, this problem occurs when we aren't sure who we really are. Like, okay, if Professor X sends his consciousness into the mind of a comatose man, is the person who wakes up still Professor X? And did the professor just murder the comatose man?
Hello, Moira.
Charles.
And I'm pretty sure that Vision Quest is going to spend a lot of time asking if White Vision is the same Vision that was killed in Infinity War, or the Vision who died in WandaVision, or the Vision who dies a second time when Vision died in Infinity War. And comic book superheroes face these problems all of the time. The Vision, Wonder Man, Swamp Thing, Clayface, they all face similar problems of identity. But Jean Grey's story is especially complicated. So this show is not the first time Jean Grey has dealt with the problem of her identity. For instance, she is Jean Grey, but she is also the Phoenix.
Not Jean. I am Phoenix!
And this was later retconned to say that the Phoenix Force was a cosmic entity who just took Jean's place. However, the memories of the Phoenix later imprinted on Jean and on her clone, Madelyne Pryor. Now, of course, Phoenix gave way to the Dark Phoenix, and she eradicated an entire star system in the comic books, and destroyed an uninhabited planet in the cartoon. But all of this means that, like within the context of the comic book and the show, nothing that Jean did as the Phoenix actually has any consequences or repercussions for Jean. She was either doing it because she was mind controlled or because it was a different cosmic entity altogether. Now, in the animated series, since it wasn't the real Jean doing all of that bad stuff, we forgave all of her actions as the Phoenix, no matter how awful her crimes.
Yeah, sure, because Jean was possessed by a fire demon from space.
Sure, but then ask yourself, why the heck does Jean suddenly become the Phoenix again when she needs to save Cable? Now, you guys know, if you watch the channel, I had a big gripe with this. I thought it was pretty annoying to have the Phoenix appear out of nowhere just to solve a problem for the writers. But this scene does remind us that Jean is not just Jean Grey anymore.
The Phoenix Force is gone now, but I could feel it deep inside, pulling me back.
Becoming the Phoenix fundamentally changed who Jean was, and no matter how much we want to believe that Jean wasn't responsible for Phoenix's crimes, the Phoenix is still a part of her. In the comic book, the Phoenix replicated Jean's mind, it fed off her emotions, and then later it shared its memories with Jean when she was resurrected from Hudson Bay. And in the animated show, in this season, we saw that Jean and the Phoenix are still linked. So here's the big question we're asking. If Jean can change into the Phoenix, or being cloned, or having memories shared between her clone and the Phoenix and herself, how much of that change can she endure and still actually be our original Jean? See guys, identity is complex, and Jean is kind of like the ship of Theseus.
Did you say what now?
The ship of Theseus, you know, like in WandaVision.
Over time, its planks of wood rot and are replaced with new planks. When no original plank remains, is it still the ship of Theseus?
Now, this is a philosophical thought experiment proposed by the ancient Greek Plutarch, where he asks us how many pieces of a ship you can replace while it is still at sea, and then have it still be that same ship. For instance, we ourselves are a lot like the ship of Theseus. We change a lot over time. Our identity feels like it stays the same, but we are always replacing parts of ourselves, physically and mentally. Like the cells in your body constantly regenerate and change, to the point where every 7 years, you are actually a completely new set of cells than you were 7 years prior. And for example, Doug, you used to be a little cute puppy.
I still am a little cute puppy.
Yes, you are, and you're the best manager a guy could ask for. So the crazy thing is, though, that Puppy Doug was not just smaller, but you also had different interests and ways of thinking. So did I when I was younger, but we grow and we change. So whatever it is that makes us who we are is intangible. It's not all that clear. And this brings us back to Jean Grey and the question of identity. Think about all the bad stuff Phoenix did. Now, we don't want to blame Jean, but if she is in some way responsible for what the Phoenix did, then shouldn't she have to answer for her crimes? Now, Jean Grey is a hero, and that's why this question has such emotional weight. We care about Jean. We know that she's a good person, but if she can be held accountable for what the Phoenix did, then she's also a murderer. The problem of identity is a big one today in the criminal justice system because, like I said earlier, people change. A person who commits a crime might not be the same person still in jail 40 years later because people change and grow.
I look back on the way I was then. Stupid kid who committed that terrible crime. I want to try to talk some sense to him.
And that seems to be what we are saying when we forgive Jean for what she did as the Phoenix. But the problem gets messy when we look at X-Men 97 and the fact that the Jean we've been invested in for the last 25 years is a clone.
Oh yeah, I kind of skipped over that. It was pretty confusing.
Well, in X-Men 97, we learned that Jean Grey was actually a clone created by Mr. Sinister. She breaks his mind control over her and then renames herself Madelyne Pryor. So that means that at some point, probably the last time Jean and Sinister met in season 4, Jean was kidnapped and cloned. The clone has all of Jean's memories and believes she is Jean, and so she replaces Jean and then lives Jean's life and even has a baby with Scott. And after the clone dies, her memories are then imprinted on the original physical body of Jean Grey. And like, guys, that's part of the emotional weight that I was talking about. We don't know when Jean was replaced, and both of them share these same memories. In fact, the Jean that the show tells us is the real Jean, or Jean Doe, struggles to remember her own life. But the clone remembers it all. So does that then mean that the clone is more real because she has full memories of Jean's entire life? So this is an old, probably unsolvable problem. So I want to talk with the real-life philosopher, Nicolas Michaud. So Nicolas, can you tell us, where, you wrote everything I just said, so where do you stand on, is there a real Jean? Like, can we ever know who the real Jean really is?
Well, that's a great question, because I think one of the things that we see is constant kind of argument and discussion about, like, if you look at what people are saying about the show and about that particular problem, they're like, who is the real Jean Grey, right? And to get to the core of the idea of real is, I think, fundamentally the problem, right? Like, what do we mean? What do we even mean by the idea of, like, is she real or is she not? Like, we can't mean, like, are they not both people, right? Unless you're somehow anti-mutant or something like that. So we have to mean something along the lines of their personal identity. Like, maybe you mean something along the lines of who was the original one. But that doesn't work very well because of exactly the problem that that's brought up by X-Men 97, right? That this idea of, well, wait a minute, I have one Jean Grey who remembers everything, was a participant up to everything up until this point, identifies herself as Jean Grey, but not just for no reason. She remembers her childhood as Jean Grey, right? The experience as the Phoenix. She remembers all of these things and then has continued to live a life, right, with Scott and with the X-Men and so on and so forth. And then we have one that doesn't.
She and Jean even bond over those shared childhood memories as well to show that they have a shared identity, yeah.
So the problem ends up being is the other Jean, especially early on, doesn't remember everything clearly. Right. And so if you look at, like, a lot of the philosophical arguments about it, what many people are going to want to say is, well, your memory is what makes you, or the real you. Well, if that's the case, then we immediately have to go to Madelyne Pryor, right? That ends up being the real Jean Grey because she's the one with all of the memory stuff. And there's a great kind of philosophical issue that comes up. Like, imagine you were in that position, right? Where, say, you and I are switched, our brains are switched through some sort of mechanical process, right? And one of us is going to be tortured and the other one gets $1 million, right? Which body do you want it to happen to? Well, probably not the body that your consciousness that your memories and all of that is in, right? You want the $1 million to go to the one that thinks like you and remembers being you and so on and so forth.
So in this scenario,
the body isn't
clone Jean is tortured and Madelyne is given the $1 million.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so she goes and she's tormented for a while, and then Madelyne gets to live this life. But then, of course, they switch that again. And I think one of the interesting things that the show does on its surface that's really smart is, well, everyone immediately goes, oh, you're the clone. You're going to be a problem, right? And there's a kind of sympathy for the real Jean or the original Jean, the Jean that is aged properly. The problem is she doesn't remember who she is, right? She's still trying to piece it together. And imagine yourself in that scenario. Like, that's part of the brilliance of it. You've suddenly been told you're a clone. And everyone's like, okay, you and your kid get out, right? In essence. I mean, and they don't say exactly that, but you would be like, no.
But they do very much side with Jean, and not Madelyne in the scenario. You're right. I didn't even think about that at the time.
Yeah, and I think it's really kind of cruel, right? And so it's like they have this knee-jerk reaction. Okay, you're fake. You're somehow connected to this malicious enterprise, so on and so forth. She has a breakdown over that, but I think for incredibly good reason. And then, though, over time, there starts being, wait a minute, let me think about this. And that's best reflected through Cyclops, right? When he has this like little psychic affair with Madelyne, and Jean gets involved and breaks into their moment, and she's angry, like, how dare you? That was our thing, she says. But the problem is, it hasn't been for we don't know how many years. You know, from her perspective, yeah, 100%. That's something that she and Scott shared.
And it's interesting, too. One thing, I'll use Mad Men as an example. Have you seen Mad Men? Okay, so,
I have not up on it.
Oh, that's okay. It's okay. So Mad Men's a great show where it's about a couple in the 60s who get divorced. And they each, go off with other people. But they still have a shared history together, even after they split. Where there's still, like, a little bit of a shared chemistry, and even through the children that they have. And I think any divorced couple can relate to that. Even if you've moved on and you're with the new person and you're happy, it's obviously more complicated in Scott's case, but even if you're happy with that new person, you still have that child or that history with your other person. So I kind of interpreted their psychic affair as that, but you're right, it also raises all these interesting questions about the nature of self. So do you think it's possible for Scott in this show, did he love both of these women equally or the same? Or do you think he loved Madelyne a little more?
So if I'm put on the spot and asked to answer it right now, and this is like held against me into the future, I'm going to say Madelyne. And the reason is going to be for the following kind of logical structure. I think what this show has really done is it smacked us upside the head with the following experience. We lived with her being Jean, not just for the 4 or 5 years that we're maybe estimating. We, those who watched the show growing up, have been living with her being Jean for 25 years, right? So we have this, you're smacked, wait a minute, that isn't her? And she doesn't remember any of that either. So I think we're in a similar positioning as Cyclops, as someone who has this shared history with Jean to a certain extent, right? Except it's this clone, right? So I think that what ends up happening is personal identity starts to fall apart. And if you look at a lot of kind of modern philosophy, they don't really think that there's a good answer to what makes you, because we're constantly changing, right? We're exchanging cells, we're sloughing off our skin, like our memories are constantly shifting. So if there's like if there has to be one thing that never changes to make you, we haven't been able to find what that thing is, right? So the problem is, what it ends up being, what makes you is probably more interactive, right? It has to do with your society, your connection to other people, the people around you.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
The way that they identify you as you. I mean, heck, they were identifying you as you before you came into the world, right?
Well, and how how people also just you know, how you interact with people, other people, and then how the other people actually see you, who the world tells you you are, essentially.
Yes.
Like
Exactly.
she was Jean, and then a few minutes later she was a clone because the world says you're just a clone.
And the monstrousness of that experience, right? They've all been telling her from her perspective that she's Jean her entire life. And now all of a sudden you're not. And that makes it true. And there's a lot of evidence kind of societally that identity kind of does work that way, because not every society identifies identity the way that we do. We tend to be kind of very kind of bodily isolated, and it's like you come into the world and then you leave the world with birth and with death. But if you look at some other societies, they might actually hold you accountable, not just for your actions, but for the actions of your family or the actions of your
ancestors. Yeah.
Right?
Like the Klingons.
So, yes. And so if this person, right, the House of Moog is entirely responsible, right? So you don't get to be absolved. You're connected. So by my lights, that just suggests to us, okay, wait a minute. Identity is more of a social construction, and what we're agreeing makes someone who they are. I think that Scott has been in a marital relationship with Madelyne for the last however many years. And so who's been present through those experiences? Madelyne, right? And there seems to be some fairly good philosophy that kind of backs that up. Like if I don't exist as myself from beginning to end, if I'm constantly shifting, then how do my marriage vows keep? You know what I mean? Like 10 years from now, through the act of living it. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not just that I said those 10 years ago, it's that I continue to, like, by living in that relationship and taking those responsibilities and duties with that person, I'm like renewing it constantly. Who has Scott been renewing it with? Madelyne.
And it's interesting too, because it's not like Madelyne and Jean are totally interchangeable. We even see differences between them in the show. Madelyne, when the show starts, is already wearing her hair down. Jean almost still always wears her hair up. I'd have to go back and look, but I think after Madelyne dies, Jean starts to wear hers down, which is another wrinkle we're adding into this, where when she absorbs Madelyne's memories, I believe. I don't know if she absorbs her entire slate of memories from the past few years or not, though.
Yeah, it gets one, because I've been trying to figure it out myself and looking at what people are saying about it. There's, I think, a really good argument to say, look, through their psychic, not only are they like literally engaging in each other's mental experiences through their psychic connections, but they're so closely aligned that they're probably constantly in touch in ways that they, now, and I'm just taking a guess here, but my guess would be that they're identical in a certain way, and so that keeps them kind of psychically in line, and so their memories start to mesh. And so now we have the problem of Madelyne has been having all these experiences with Scott while Jean was being tortured, right? But now that they're sharing memory experiences, Jean is catching up with that, and so she, from her experience, has also been having those experiences with Scott. So it gets real messy real quick.
So I want to throw out a couple wrinkles here. I want to ask you about the Phoenix, because that's a whole other bit of identity. But before I get to that, you know, we're talking in very straight, literal terms. We're saying, like, you know, like you said, Western culture, where we are what we remember. We're shaped by our memories and experiences. However, we're talking about a subgenre of science fiction here, where people are telepathic and they have an astral psionic self. So whether or not you believe in the spiritual or the soul in the real world, it 100% exists within the world of the X-Men. Now, maybe the soul is not like a spirit placed in you by God that leaves your body when you die, but there are astral projection forms here. And I think that those forms that we see in past episodes where, like, Jean is helping Xavier fight the Shadow King and things like that, that psionic energy is truly Jean Grey. Like, that is the Jean Grey without this this meat sack we call a body, you know, and the same thing goes for Madelyne. So in that case, don't they have very real identities, or are those astral forms still informed by the memories of the past few years?
No, I think that's a great question. because it's so in-world, right? You're basically saying, well, let's play fair based on the rules of that world, whether or not we have that position outside of it. And my response has to be, well, wait a minute. Think about what you just said about kind of informing that soul, that psionic self with our experiences. It's the same problem that we have when we deal with the question of the soul in our own, whatever this non-superhero-ish realm we exist in is, where the soul would have to be something that is also shifting and changing. We like the idea of the soul being something that makes me me, right? That tends to be when you go down the line, you're like, what makes me, well, it's not my genetics, because my genetics change. There's epigenetic changes, right? My body can change, my memories can change. So what makes me me? Well, okay, my soul. The problem is, unless you want to say that your soul has none of your personality, none of your memories, none of the things that you literally think of when you think of you, then your soul has to be changing, right? It has to add memories. It has to... You get what I'm saying, though? Like, there's
I do. But so the soul,
right?
Just to keep with Star Trek for a second, the soul is a bit like the Trill. I'm saying, like, in keeping with resurrection, things like that, like the idea that we're reincarnated. So we have this soul that would retain memories and change, but I think the idea is more that the psionic energy, the psionic self, or the soul, tells our body and our life who we are, and not necessarily our experiences informing the soul. Does that make sense? Like, yes. I think the soul, the idea of the soul is like, it's soul, it's eternal. It is that ray of light that Kurt Vonnegut wrote about in Breakfast of Champions. I think that's where I would see it, at least. That's how I've always imagined it.
Well, see, there's a couple of issues that I see kind of like coming up, right? And one of which is the problem of if the soul is what's doing like the writing on the personality, as opposed to the personality and the memory doing the writing on the soul, right? Well, then the problem is, how do any of my experiences actually matter in terms of helping construct who I am? I think we end up cheating a little bit, you know what I mean? Because we really want that personal identity and we really want that soul, but we also want to think, well, I grow, right? I grow with my experiences. I'm some ways fundamentally different, right? If you have a child or you get possessed by the Phoenix Force, you're different than you were previously. If your soul is not impacted by the external world, then you're not actually really changed. Whatever fundamentally makes you you, in terms of your experiences, actually never really mattered. The other problem that comes up is what happens is it ends up reducing down to the word soul or psionic self really just becomes another word for me. Like, if the question is, what makes me me? And I'm trying to figure out, well, it's not this or this or this or this. Well, I say, okay, well, is it my soul? And then I say to you, okay, what is it about your soul that makes it you? Or what is it about your soul that makes it yours? Well, we start even in the idea of the Marvel universe, right? This psionic self. Well, we go, well, I don't know. It's mine, not anybody else's. Well, what makes it yours and not somebody else's? It has to be different in some way, right? And we end up, well, what makes Jean Grey's soul her soul and not Madelyne's soul? Well, the fact that it's Jean Grey. Or is it
possible that the clone splits it because their minds are split? Like, we don't know, like, the mechanics of how closely that psionic astral form is attached to the actual mutant brain that produces it either. There's also that. Like,
right. How does she not have a clone of the psionic self? If the psionic self, right? Like, you start going down, like, because what we've done is we've basically cheated and said, well, it's you. But what makes it me?
I've always thought of it like when you log into, say, any kind of one, like World of Warcraft, right? You log on, you have your avatar name. That's like your worldly body moving through a different realm, but you are still you in this world. And I always kind of thought that that's how Western religion perceives the soul. And also how it's the psionic self is treated in the X-Men comics. Like, the Shadow King once had a body, I think, or did he come from, is he a mutant? They've retconned it. I think originally he was a mutant who then his spirit was gone. I think they've changed it to where he is like an evil being who inhabits. I think they flipped that on me, so sorry about that. But you get the idea. That it is like an entity that possesses this flesh for an amount of time and then moves on. Which brings me to the Phoenix Force. So earlier we talked about how Jean is treated as if she has no culpability for the Phoenix's crimes. And, we could get into the weeds of the show versus the comics. In the comics, she actually does kill 1 billion people. In the show, they cleverly sidestepped that. And they even said out loudly, thank goodness that star system was uninhabited. The Phoenix is dangerous. But she still, wrecked things and fought the X-Men and committed these crimes. Now, the reason for that, I think definitely within the show, and I think within the comic too, was that the Phoenix as a cosmic force was a force of nature. It's a being, it consumes, it dies, it's resurrected. That's what it does. But as soon as it attached itself to Jean, it fed off of her own sense of self and her own sense of emotions, to the point where the Phoenix, when it possessed Jean's body, like the soul or the psionic energy we're talking about, to the point where the Phoenix actually was transformed. It was the soul writing on the Phoenix, if you will, to where she was changed. So how does the Phoenix, even doing that and even leaving Jean, how did that change Jean from the Jean that we knew? And we started off this video by saying that the Jean that we originally knew is probably dead already. Is that when that started to happen?
Yeah, so, well, two brief answers. One is my basic take on it, that Jean Grey, by virtue of changing and growing throughout her existence, is not the same Jean Grey as the one who was 1 year old, right? And the Jean Grey who, right, like the Jean Grey who ages into infirmity or whatnot, assuming she does, will not be the same Jean Grey who's 30 years old, right? That those are fundamentally different people. It doesn't feel like that, and we want to latch onto something because we have such a strong sense of self. But if you think about it, your sense of self, if you connect it with your past, you don't really feel like your past self. Like if I said, hey, Ryan, how much connectedness do you feel with your 1 year old self? There's an excellent chance you'd be like, I have very little in common with that guy. But you also... I
no longer spend my spare time trying to see what fits in my mouth.
Yes, exactly.
Phrasing.
So, but now, right? But now you are someone who feels like you will continue to exist as yourself even as you change, which is a little bit insane. Like, so we can reflect backwards and be like, wow, that wasn't me, right? That wasn't me. But when I look into the future, that'll still be me. And so one, I think that's one kind of issue with like the Phoenix and so on and so forth. The other is like kind of the in-universe answer, I think ends up being one of, I can't know without articulation by the text, by the cartoon, what is actually happening in terms of Jean and the Phoenix and how they are intertwined or not. I can only look at their actions and the things that they say. Right. And I think that's the same problem with the soul in general, is we have a strong tendency to use the soul to get ourselves out of problems when we have no access to it. And that's not my saying it doesn't exist. That's my saying, right? Like, it's like the one thing you don't use to identify yourself when you're at the airport, right? When you're going through like anything sort of process of identifying another person. But we'll say, gosh darn it, that psionic self is me. But when you're looking for me, look for the short guy, hair's going back and with the beard, right? Look for.
Don't find my aura.
Right.
Yeah, we don't have aura readers at the airport. It'd be a lot more simple if we did, actually.
And it leads to huge problems where, like, literally throughout the course of human history, we've said multiple times, oh, that group of people, they don't have souls. Or those animals, they don't have souls. So do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. And they have no ability to prove it. Because literally you can say, no, really, I do. And show me. I have to look at what Jean is saying and what the Phoenix is doing. And you pointed out, like, wow, the Phoenix just kind of comes out of nowhere, saves them from a writing problem. I agree. I think in universe, what it ends up doing is it ends up telling us that they were never really fully separated. And they even articulate that to a certain extent, that there's an imprinting that has happened. So now the problem is Jean somehow still responsible for what the Phoenix did? And the way we tend to go when it comes to those kinds of things is, well, I guess to some extent, to the extent that she remembers it and participated in it.
Boy, I really hate that Phoenix moment. I've thought about that. I've watched that show through every episode at least twice, and I just can't reconcile it. Especially the way they're like, she's gone now. I'm like, I really think, we've said this on the show too. that they just didn't know if they were getting the second season, and they wanted to tell the X-Men story, and they wanted to hit all the high points. And if the show runs 5 years, they're going to be very embarrassed that they splurged on the Phoenix so early. So that's all interesting. And again, I think it's hard for us to ascertain what the meaning of the Phoenix is in the show when I'm not 100% sure they laid out the rules themselves. And again, I love this show. I'm talking about one very small thing that took me completely out of the show. But I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier. We talked about a sense of self that is achieved through the perception of others. And this is so interesting because one thing we were talking about earlier is how superhero comics have been addressing these complicated identities through characters like Vision or Ultron or Wonder Man and all this other stuff. But the X-Men specifically seem to really be focused on a sense of self through the perception of others. They are defined. If you're going to say, well, how are the X-Men different from the Avengers? They protect people who hate and fear them. The Avengers just say we protect Earth. But the X-Men are defined by their perception of how others see them. So for poor Madelyne, it's like she's a mutant with a little bit of mutant added.
Yeah. You know, that's such a brilliant point. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms. The way that I've thought about Madelyne is the way that we try to redefine ourselves when other people look at us in a certain way. Kind of to your earlier point, like, well, how do I address this problem? Like with the Phoenix in universe, I was thinking about it. For me, the thing that stuck out, and I might be completely wrong about this, but my moment of like, oh, that takes me out for a second, is she says,
Call me Madelyne Pryor.
She says that to Jean, and immediately my brain goes, where that comes. She doesn't say like, oh, that's my middle name. Or, you know, sometimes in a narrative, they'll be like, oh, I'm going to go by them. You know, it's like Thomas.
Like Ben Reilly, Spider-Man's clone, chose Uncle
exactly.
Ben and May's maiden name, yeah.
So you go, like, so where did that come from? Now we know, oh, well, this comes from this comic origin and that it has this like really like messed up experience with Cyclops and all of that. Right. But if we were just to go in universe, that's not connected, because I think like Chris Claremont pulls the name from a band, right? From a singer in a band. If we
I didn't know that. That's cool. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice.
But if we were instead to play by the rules of the universe, right, in there, which is my favorite way to do things anyways, like how are they explaining it there?
Much more interesting, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's two things that because I love etymologies. Like one, if you look at what the name Madelyne means, it has an ancient Greek origin. One of its meanings is high tower, like a lighthouse, right? So it has a connection to light and fire, which is interesting, given her connection to the Phoenix. But also Pryor, right? Now, in the comics, Sinister might give her that name as kind of like to poke at her, but here, that doesn't happen. In this case, she takes on, to the best of our knowledge at this moment, the name for herself. Why she choose that name? And I like to think it's because she's literally naming herself Pryor Light. So she is reconstructing her, like she has good reason to believe that she's first. One, she feels like it. She has exactly the same reason to believe that she's herself that you do and I do. But also, in a lot of ways, it's her memories that are now helping fix and inform Jean Grey's, right? Jean, I think, in part, is able to reconstruct her memories because of her experiences with Madelyne. Their connectedness together does that. So there's a sense in which she's saying, yeah, you can put me on the outside, but I am going to construct my own identity. And I think, to answer your question in a roundabout way, I think that's a lot of times what the mutants have to do, right? What you see people like Magneto doing, like, you want to put me on the outside, I'm going to put myself on the inside, now you're on the outside.
Exactly.
That can become dangerous, like, I've decided to wipe you all out.
Right. Or it can be positive, like building your own mutant culture or your own music, or, you know, repressed minorities have done that for centuries.
Yeah, they reconstruct the narrative, right? You know, and they'll take on the words that were used to insult them, and they'll say, no, I've reconstructed that in a way that I see fit. And so what that says to me is not only do people outside of us help construct our identities, because we're talking about like your parents might decide who you are before, you know, they name you, they decorate your room, but also a lot of people reconstruct that identity. They reject that identity. So it's not that we have no say in it, it's that our past self has an impact on this current version of us, right? And I'm deciding right now what kind of baggage future Nicolas Michaud is going to have to deal with.
Yeah, the child is the father of the man, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Look, I could talk about this for hours, but I can't because people wouldn't click on the video. This has been fantastic. Where do you have like a Twitter, or where do people find you if they want to hear your thoughts on things like this?
So honestly, right now they can just find me at PhilosophyLives at gmail.com. I have like a little YouTube blog that I did for a while. It's super defunct.
Cool.
So,
all right, we'll have your links down in the
questions.
comments. We'll have your links down in the description. I mean, so Nicolas, thank you again for joining us. And guys, I hope you enjoyed this talk. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. If you want to let us know what you think, who is the real Jean Grey? How the hell did the Phoenix come back? We would love your canon theories so you can win a no prize. Let us know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, welcome to the channel and please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.